Hello friends and welcome to the special series on language and speech. We were talking about the origin of language, and in continuation today we will be discussing more about this topic. Let us talk about the gossip and grooming hypothesis. Now, gossip, according to Robin Dunbar, does for group living humans what manual grooming does for other primates. It allows individuals to service their relationships, so to maintain their alliances on the basis of the principle, if you scratch my back, I will scratch yours. As humans begin to live in larger and larger social groups, the task of manually grooming all one's friends and acquaintances becomes so time consuming as to be unaffordable. In response to this problem, humans invented a cheap and ultra efficient form of grooming, that is vocal grooming. To keep your allies happy, you now needed only to groom them with low cost vocal sounds, servicing multiple allies simultaneously while keeping both hands free for other tasks. Vocal grooming then evolved gradually into vocal language, initially in form of gossip. Critics of this theory point out that the very efficiency of vocal grooming, the fact that words are so cheap, would have undermined its capacity to signal commitment of the kind conveyed by time consuming and costly manual grooming. A further criticism is that the theory does nothing to explain the crucial transition from vocal grooming, that is the production of pleasing but meaningless sounds, to cognitive complexities of syntactical speech. Now, let us talk about ritual or speech co-evolution. The ritual speech co-evolution theory was originally proposed by distinguished social anthropologist Roy Rappaport. Before being elaborated by anthropologists such as Chris Knight, Jerome Lewis, Nick Enfield, Camilla Power and Ian Watts, cognitive scientist and robotics engineer Lux Steels is another prominent supporter of this general approach, as is biological anthropologist neuroscientist Therese Deacon. These scholars argue that there can be no such thing as a theory of the origin of language. This is because language is not a separate adaptation, but an internal aspect of something much wider, namely human symbolic culture as a whole. Lie an alternative inherent in language pose problems to any society whose structure is founded on language, which is to say all human societies. I have therefore argued that if there are to be words at all, it is necessary to establish the word, and that the word is established by invariance of liturgy. And unquote, this is by Roy Rappaport, 1979. Advocates of this school of thought point out that words are cheap. As digital hallucinations, they are intrinsically unreliable. Should an especially clever ape or even a group of articulate apes try to use words in the wild, they would carry no conviction. The primate vocalizations that do carry conviction, those they actually use, are unlike words, in that they are emotionally expressive, intrinsically meaningful and reliable because they are relatively costly and hard to fake. Language consists of digital contrasts whose cost is essentially zero. As pure social conventions, signals of this kind cannot evolve in a Darwinian social world. They are a theoretical impossibility. Being intrinsically unreliable, language works only if you can build up a reputation for trustworthiness within a certain kind of society, namely one where symbolic cultural facts, sometimes called institutional facts, can be established and maintained through collective social endorsement. In any hunter-gathering society, the basic mechanism for establishing trust in symbolic cultural facts is collective ritual. Therefore, the task facing researchers into the origins of language is more multidisciplinary than it is usually supposed. It involves addressing the evolutionary emergence of human symbolic culture as a whole, with language an important but subsidiary component. Critics of this theory include Noam Chomsky, who terms it the non-existent hypothesis, a denial of the very existence of language as an object of study for natural science. Chomsky's own theory is that language emerged in an instant and in perfect form, prompting his critics in turn to retort that only something that does not exist, a theoretical construct or convenient scientific fiction, could possibly emerge in such a miraculous way. The controversy remains unresolved. Now, let us talk about gestural theory. Gestural theory states that human language developed from gestures that were used for simple communication. Two types of evidence support this theory. Gestural language and vocal language depend on similar neural systems. The regions on the cortex that are responsible for mouth and hand movement border each other. Non-human primates can use gestures or symbols for at least primitive communication, and some of their gestures resemble those of humans, such as the begging posture with the hands stretched out, which humans share with chimpanzees. Research has found strong support for the idea that verbal language and sign language depend on similar neural structures. Patients who used sign language and who suffered from a left hemisphere lesion showed the same disorders with their sign language as vocal patients did with their oral language. Other researchers found that the same left hemisphere brain regions were active during sign language as during the use of vocal or written language. The important question for gestural theories is why there was a shift to vocalization. Various explanations have been proposed. Our ancestors started to use more and more tools, meaning that their hands were occupied and could no longer be used for gesturing. Manual gesturing required that speakers and listeners be visible to one another. In many situations, they might need to communicate even without visual contact, for example, after nightfall or when foliage obstructs visibility. A composite hypothesis holds that early language took the form of part gestural and part vocal mimesis, that is, imitative song and dance, combining modalities because all signals like those of apes and monkeys still needed to be costly in order to be intrinsically convincing. In that event, each multimedia display would have needed not just to disambiguate an intended meaning, but also to inspire confidence in the signal's reliability. The suggestion is that only once community-wide contractual understandings had come into force could trust in communicative intentions be automatically assumed, at last allowing Homo sapiens to shift to a more efficient default format. Since vocal distinctive features, that is sound contrast, are ideal for this purpose, it was only at this point when intrinsically persuasive body language was no longer required to convey each message that the decisive shift from manual gesture to our currently primary reliance on spoken language occurred. Humans still use one hand and facial gestures when they speak, especially when people meet who have no language in common. There are also, of course, a great number of sign languages still in existence, commonly associated with deaf communities. It is important to note that these sign languages are equal in complexity, sophistication, and expressive power to any oral language. The cognitive functions are similar and the parts of the brain used are similar. The main difference is that the phonemes are produced on the outside of the body, articulated with hands, body, and facial expression, rather than inside the body, articulated with tongue, teeth, lips, and breathing. Critics of gestural theory note that it is difficult to name serious reasons why the initial pitch-based vocal communication, which is present in primates, would be abandoned in favor of much less effective non-vocal gestural communication. Now, let us talk about mirror neurons and language origins. In humans, functional MRI studies have reported finding areas homologous to the monkey mirror neuron system in the inferior frontal cortex close to Broca's area, one of the hypothesized language region of the brain. This has led to suggestions that human language evolved from a gesture performance understanding system implemented in mirror neurons. Mirror neurons have been said to have the potential to provide a mechanism for action understanding, imitation learning, and the simulation of other people's behavior. This hypothesis is supported by some cytoarchitectonic homologies between monkey premotor area F5 and human Broca's area. Rates of vocabulary expansion linked to the ability of children to vocally mirror non-words and so to acquire the new word pronunciations. Such speech repetition occurs automatically, fast and separately in the brain to speech perception. Moreover, such vocal imitation can occur without comprehension, such as in speech shadowing and echolalia. Further evidence for this link comes from a recent study in which the brain activity of two participants was measured using MRI while they were gesturing words to each other using hand gestures with a game of charades, a modality that some have suggested might represent the evolutionary precursor of human language. Analysis of the data using Granger causality revealed that the mirror neuron system of the observer indeed reflects the pattern of activity in the motor systems of the sender, supporting the idea that the motor concept associated with the words is indeed transmitted from one brain to another using the mirror system. It must be noticed that the mirror neuron system seemed to be inherently inadequate to play any role in the syntax, given that this definitory property of human languages, which is implemented in hierarchical recursive structure, is flattened into linear sequences of phonemes, making recursive structure not accessible to sensory detection. According to Dean Falk's putting the baby down theory, vocal interaction between early hominin mothers and infants sparked a sequence of events that led eventually to our ancestors' earliest words. The basic idea is that evolving human mothers, unlike their monkey and ape counterparts, couldn't move around and forage with their infants clinging onto their backs. Loss of fur in human cases left infants with no means of clinging on. Frequently, therefore, mothers had to put their babies down. As a result, these babies needed to be reassured that they were not being abandoned. Mothers responded by developing motherese, an infant-directed communicative system embracing facial expressions, body language, touching, patting, caressing, laughter, tickling, and emotionally expressive contact calls. The argument is that language somehow developed out of all this. Critics note that while this theory may explain a certain kind of infant-directed proto-language today known as motherese, it does little to solve the really difficult problem, which is the emergence among adults of syntactical speech. However, in the mental and the social life of babies, psychologist Kenneth K. noted that no usable adult language could have evolved without interactive communication between very young children and adults. No symbolic system could have survived from one generation to next if it could not have been easily acquired by young children under their normal condition of social life. Grammaticalization is a continuous historical process in which freestanding words develop into grammatical appendages, while these in turn become ever more specialized and grammatical. An initially incorrect usage in becoming accepted leads to unforeseen consequences, triggering knock-on effect and extended sequence of change. Paradoxically, grammar evolves because in the final analysis, humans care less about grammatical niceties than about making themselves understood. If this is how grammar evolves today, according to this school of thought, we can legitimately infer similar principle at work among our distant ancestors, when grammar itself was being first established. In order to reconstruct the evolutionary transition from early language to languages with complex grammar, we need to know which hypothetical sequences are plausible and which are not. In order to convey abstract ideas, the first recourse of speaker is to fall back on immediately recognizable concrete imagery, very often deploying metaphor rooted in shared bodily experience. A familiar example is the use of concrete terms such as belly or back to convey abstract meanings such as inside or behind. Equally metaphorical is the strategy of representing temporal patterns on the model of spatial ones. Hence, in English we say it is going to rain modeled on I am going to London. We might abbreviate this colloquially to it's gonna rain. Even when in a hurry, we don't say I'm gonna London. The contraction is restricted to the job of specifying tense. From such example, we can see why grammaticalization is consistently unidirectional, from concrete to abstract meaning, not the other way around. Grammaticalization theorists picture early language as simple, perhaps consisting only of nouns. Even under that extreme theoretical assumption, however, it is difficult to imagine what cognitive inhibition would realistically have prevented people from using, say, spare as if it were a verb, as we do in English. Let's spare this pig. Irrespective of the niceties of grammar as professional linguists understand it, people in real life would surely have used their nouns as verbs or their verbs as noun as occasion demanded. In short, while a noun only language might seem theoretically possible, grammaticalization theory indicates that it cannot have remained fixed in that state for any length of time. Creativity derives grammatical change. This presupposes a certain attitude on the part of listeners. Instead of punishing deviation from accepted usage, listeners must prioritize imaginative mind reading. Creativity and reliability are incompatible demands for Machiavellian primates as for animals generally. The overriding pressure is to demonstrate reliability. If humans escape these constraints, it is because in our case listeners are primarily interested in mental states. To focus on mental states is to accept fictions, inhabitants of imagination as potentially informative and interesting. But human listeners are not pedants, insistent on point by point factual accuracy. They want to know what the speaker has in mind. Grammaticalization is essentially based on metaphor. To outlaw its use would be to stop grammar from evolving and by the same token to exclude all possibility of expressing abstract thought. A criticism of all this is while grammaticalization theory might explain language change today, it does not satisfactorily address the really difficult challenge, explaining the initial transition from primate style communication to language as we know it. Rather, the theory assumed that language already exists. As Bernd Hein and Tanya Koteva acknowledge, grammaticalization requires a linguistic system that is used regularly and frequently within a community of speakers and is passed on from one group of speakers to another. Outside modern humans, such conditions does not prevail. So, we have discussed a lot about different theories of origin of language and how it actually evolved. It is basically a matter of debate among all the researchers and scholars, but we have to take in lot of angles and perspective in order to have a better understanding of the subject. Thank you so much for watching.